First of all, thank you for the very nice introduction. I would also like to say thank you on behalf of COBE for the invitation to come and present here today at camp. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to explaining a little bit about COBE's projects and what we're working on at the moment. This is our mission statement. For us, architecture is to create unique opportunities for people, places, and communities. And the reason why we have this in focus is because we want the people who are going to use our projects to have them as our focal point. You could say that COBE is focused in three aspects: urbanism, public space, and architecture. And the reason why we like to work in these three fields as an interdisciplinary office is because we find that in order to make good architecture, we have to be informed about the public spaces that are around the buildings. We have to be informed about the master plans that we build within. And likewise, when we do master plans, we also have to know about the buildings and the public space. So we find this cross-fertilization between these three fields is a key element in how we approach architecture. We like to believe of architecture as a collective impact, and that's very much that we work as a collective. This is our office, currently based at the Paper Island. We will be moving shortly, but I can get back to that later. You could say this is sort of the archetypical approach of the classic architect, sitting alone, working, drawing, making sketches, and handing these sketches over to somebody who executes them. That's not how we work. We use Lego as a metaphor for this sort of a collective approach to creating architecture. And like this Olafur Eliasson installation where he put a lot of Lego in a public space. This is how we would like to make buildings internally with the teams that are working on the projects, because we have landscape architects, we have urbanists, we have constructing architects, and we have architects. And we like to work together to make projects, but also with our clients and with stakeholders and with users in the neighborhoods that we're building, so that together we can make these magnificent structures, like all these people that collectively work together in these public Lego projects. So zooming out, the globe is undergoing massive pressure because the population is growing exponentially. And what we see now is that there's an immense urbanization going on in the planet, that people are seeking towards cities, and that our built spaces are just growing. And this has a series of effects. One being that actually there's a huge contrast between rich and poor, very much shown in this building or this site in Brazil. The contrast between rich and poor being very prominent here. But also there's immense pressure on our infrastructure. And there's also pressure on our welfare system, as we like to show in this sort of character image. We don't have the big answer for all these problems, but what we wanted to do a few years ago, after COBE turned 10, we wanted to make a retrospective and sort of give our take on what we learned from working in Copenhagen. As part of this retrospective, sorry, we produced a book called Our Urban Living Room, but we also had an exhibition ongoing. And the basis of this exhibition was to try and explain how Copenhagen went from being a poor city on the verge of a bankruptcy to being the most livable city in the world, where people use the city in a completely different way than it was intended, like this guy who built a living room on a raft and he's sailing around Copenhagen when the sun is shining. Copenhagen has been deemed one of the most livable cities many times by Monocle. We're also mentioned as being the happiest people in the world. But looking at our built environment, we don't really have any sort of prominent structures like the Eiffel Tower or the Statue of Liberty or Big Ben. we have our little mermaid. And it's really funny, of course, when people visit it, because it's quite small. But that's not what Copenhagen has been branding itself on. It's been branding itself on livability. And one of the symbols of this livability is, for example, the bicycle. How bicycles are sort of an integrated usage in everybody's life. So that when people, they come and visit the city, they want to sort of experience this new social infrastructure that sort of is the backbone of the livability and the high living standards of Denmark and of Copenhagen. So as part of our urban living room, we sort of categorized 6 themes, the first of which is from infrastructure to public space. And it's sort of asking this question: why does infrastructure fill so much of our public space in cities today? This is sort of a very picturesque building of a picture of a lady taking her kid to the daycare in the morning. That's what it's maybe like for the past few weeks when the sun is shining. But bicycles are an integrated transportation means in Denmark. And the first project I want to share with you is Nørreport. And as Stefan mentioned, it's this red dot that you can see here on screen. And it's basically at the most congested point in all of Copenhagen, and it has basically 250,000 people passing through by regional trains, by buses, by metro, by local trains. So it's sort of at the epicenter of everything. And when Nørreport was first built, it had this very beautiful public space on top. It was very well functioning, and it had a very nice usability. But over time, Nørreport sort of transformed itself into a small station in between 6 lane roads. And basically the station was completely congested by bicycles. This is a quite profound image for our approach on Nørreport, because it basically, in the snow, you can sort of see the walking patterns of people using the old Nørreport station. And this is actually what we wanted to learn from. So this is Nørreport as how it used to look, and basically we were given the possibility to completely rethink this public space. And the only guidelines we had to sort of work within was, of course, the building blocks of the city, but also these sort of existing stairs leading down to the train. So what we tried to do was map the usage of the space, how people used it before we had to rethink the space. And this actually gave us sort of an insight to how we could sort of reconfigure the space. And what we learned from this was actually a series of islands sort of popped up. And these series of islands could sort of be used for buildings. They could be used for combining bicycle parking spots. And they could be put in such a way that they wouldn't influence in the way people use the space. So basically, looking at it today, the space is actually a series of roofs and bicycle parkings that are combined in these sort of bicycle beds, we call them. The roofs are used to not only create covered public spaces, but they're also used to sort of emphasize where do you have buildings, where do you have accesses to underground metro lines, but also to make covered bicycle parkings. So that one of the first things you see when you come up from Nørreport is these sort of floating concrete clouds on top of the stairs, and then you come up to this new public space. The other aim that we tried to have in this project was to make a lot of transparency to make sure that you could sort of oversee and find your way on the plaza, because you're moving very quickly. You have to change between buses to train, from bicycle to train, and so forth. So we wanted to have a plaza that was transparent, not only at day, but also at night. So this is why we also really worked a lot with the illumination of buildings and how these concrete roofs are illuminated. Here you can sort of see like the contrast between the existing building structure and these completely new geometric shapes that somehow land in the center of Copenhagen. This image here somehow sums up the key elements in the project. Basically, we have these roofs that mark where you have not only public functions, but also where you have access to underground stairs, but also where you have the bicycle parkings, and you have these clear routings in between. But to make this work, we had to do something that's very simple, and what we did was, where we made these bicycle beds, we pushed down the ground between 30 or 40 centimeters to sort of make sure that we emphasize these bicycle beds. And this means that the bicycles are lowered compared to the pavement that you walk on. So that when you park your bike in a busy morning and you have to come back in the afternoon to pick it up, you can easily get an overview of the parking of the bicycles. What also made it possible is that we were able to design our own bicycle stand for this project. And what's unique about this bicycle stand is that it packs the bicycles very tightly, but also that there is a small illumination point on top, so that during day, this absorbs daylight in a PE cell, and then at night it illuminates. Here you can see how the bicycles are able to be packed extra tight so that we can make space for as many bicycles as possible. And then at night, you can see here how these bicycle stands, they illuminate and they can sort of help your orientation on the plaza. Next to Nørreport, you have Israels Plads, which we called Copenhagen's biggest urban carpet. And what you see here is this is a Nørreport with the 6 roofs. And here you have Israels Plads, and it's a giant square, which also historically was used as a market plaza, and it had this fantastic usage and potential. And during the course of the 60s, 50s and 60s, when the cars came, this plaza was gradually overtaken by parking spots. But today, the plaza is this urban carpet where the parking is placed underneath. And you can actually see here how we try to develop this open and democratic plaza that's used, that anybody can use, somebody walking their kids with a stroller, but also this homeless guy here that he's able to sit and drink his beer and enjoy the public space. Looking from above, you can see here how the plaza, it stretches and transitions into the park right next to it, somehow catching the park. And at the same time, you have these punctures of different functions. You have a skateboard park, you have a basketball field, you have this rubber carpet around it that people can sit and watch the basketball games and so forth. And then you have these 2 folds on the plaza, which also act as like these urban tribunes where people can sit and overlook the life on the plaza. What's interesting about the plaza is that there's a big school right next to it, Sales, and it's not only used as a public plaza, but it's also used as the school's playground. So every day when there's a recess, the kids, they can run out onto the plaza and they can play basketball, they can skateboard and so forth. And here you can sort of, I was asked earlier, what is our urban living room? And for us, this image somehow really sums up our urban living room, this idea of how people sort of use public spaces today as an extension of their homes. Here you can see how people sit on this rubber tribune and they watch basketball games. And what's really profound about this change is that if you could say that this is one of the historic images of the market squares, then you can see how the plaza today is used by hipsters and families and everybody, and everybody's welcome in this sort of open democratic space. Here there's traditional folk dances from many, many years ago. And today, the kids, they do the dancing on the plaza, while parents, they can sit on the tribune and overlook, and kids can jump in and out of the water fountain. What's nice to see is that the plaza, it isn't just something that works really nice when it's nice and sunny, but also during the winter, people are using it actively. Kids are playing in the snow. It functions all year round, so it's not just something that's based on good weather. And it has many functions. Kids, they can skateboard, they can BMX, and you can also sit and check your Facebook page without being disturbed. So it's really this plaza that embraces everybody. And what's nice to see, of course, on the social media is how the plaza is used by many different people. So this is sort of a documentation of the many different usages. If it's somebody on a maternity leave walking their kid in a stroller, or lots of kids skateboarding, or even when Tony Hawk, he wants to visit the city, he tries the skateboard park, which is very nice to see. The last project I want to show in this under this theme is Kua University Square, which is a series of landscape hills, and it's a project that somehow tries to embrace the knowledge that we gain from both Nørreport and Israels Plads. And this space is a sort of leftover space between a lot of university buildings, and you could see that it's basically was used for just storage of bicycle parking, and it's somehow a leftover space between the buildings. So no thought was given to the potential of the space. So after participating in a competition, what we proposed was actually combining the bicycle parking under a series of concrete hills, so that you could sort of combine and consolidate the bicycle parking, but you could also make a new public space on top. And here you can see these three bicycle mounds and some other bicycle beds, and how the plaza in between these buildings, it slowly transitions down to this green area. And the idea being is that you have these covered bicycle parkings, which is of course nice because your bicycle doesn't get wet. But the most significant part of the design is that you have this new public space on top of the concrete shells. And here you can see some of the sections and how these new tribunes actually can work, this new public space, so that students in between classes, they can come out and sit, talk, smoke cigarettes, or drink a cup of coffee, or just have a debate about some subject they're working on. An image of how the project should look when it's completed. The project is currently being built and should be finished by the end of this year. So the second theme that we sort of wanted to talk about in our urban living room was transformation as a resource. And it's this notion of why do we tear down buildings instead of reusing them. On Nørrebrogade, when you ride your bicycle on one of the gables, you see this one man's trash is another man's treasure. And it's a quite profound statement, because it's this mindset of rethinking our built environment and looking into the potential of some of our built structures. An example of this is the B&W halls, which was quickly transformed, and it became this sort of crazy stage for the Eurovision Song Contest a few years ago. But another example of this could be the silo, which is an old grain silo, which was transformed into this urban anchor point. The silo project is basically this silo here, the DLG silo, which was used for grain storage. And basically, COBE won the master plan for the North Harbour. And one of our attempts to work within this master plan is to embrace the built structure as an industrial heritage. And this means is that we wanted to convince the owner of the land, the City Port Authority, that they shouldn't demolish it. And luckily, along with a very visionary client, we were able to convince the City Port Authority that the building actually shouldn't be slated for demolition, but actually had a huge potential. And this is a few images showing this transformation process. What we saw when we first looked into the silo, this is an isometric view, sort of giving an X-ray into the building. And basically what it shows is that some of these amazing spaces that you find inside of this grain silo that have a huge potential and actually wouldn't be built today. If you went to the developer, you wouldn't be allowed to build an 8-meter high space or a 5-meter high space. It would challenge you and say, why? 3 meters is enough. So a lot of these things inside the silo were just a gift for the project. So what we wanted to do is basically have this building and reprogram it. So one of the significant parts of this reprogramming is to make sure that the building interacts with the ground level, the grade level, so that it remains public, so there are public functions at grade level, but also to make sure that the view from the top also becomes accessible by the people of Copenhagen. Like here in Prague, in Copenhagen, we're not really allowed to make high buildings. So this is one of the high built structures of Copenhagen that we wanted to make sure that was accessible for the public. And in between, you could then, of course, fill with all the housing you needed. And basically what we had to do in order to make this housing project is to put a new skin on the project. And behind the skin, we had to cut holes in the concrete to make it daylight come inside the building. And this is an early facade drawing of what it was supposed to look like. And here you can see the different levels that you have inside the building. From the grade level to different varying heights inside the building to this magnificent 8-meter high space and to a new restaurant on top. So that basically transforming this building meant that we could sort of give it a new dress. In order to give it a new dress, we had to sort of cut holes in the concrete. But what we also did was we developed an intelligent skin, we like to call it, not because we wanted to sound more clever than we are, but it's basically an idea that we wanted to make a series of prefabricated elements that could be built on a factory and then assembled on site. And these prefabricated elements, they had to fulfill a few requirements. We wanted to make sure that the balconies were an integrated part of the facade design, so that we don't have these balconies sticking out all over the place. We also wanted to make sure that the windows are an integrated part of the facade design, but also that you have this new rain jacket, these galvanized steel panels, and behind the steel panels you also have an insulation to make sure that the building, it fulfills current building codes. And here you can see this patchwork of different facade elements that was needed in order to make this project work. It can be sort of these elements with balconies in it. It can also be elements with fixed glass. It could also be closed panels here where you have elevators going up and down the building. And this intelligent skin has required a lot of skill from the contractor to build at such a detail to make sure that this joint work would work out the way we wanted it to. So that the building, when you see it, it's basically a full new skin surrounding the building with these balconies and windows and that are integrated in the facade design. These are a series of plan drawings which basically are meant to, I don't want to get into the unique plan drawings, but what we wanted to do is to try and challenge the spatial configuration in the building to make sure that we could make a series of unique apartments. So in total, there's only 40 apartments in this building. It's high-end luxury apartments that we were able to develop for this project. So that when you step inside the building, you have these cutouts in the concrete envelope of the existing grain silo, and that you have these new skin on the outside. And what was important for us, and we made this decision very early on, is to make sure that the silo is very present inside the building. Unfortunately, we had to put a new skin on it, but inside the building you still have this feeling, the sensation of being inside a grain silo, but also having the ability to work on these like very nicely designed apartment units that have these contrasting elements, these really nice wood details that are juxtaposed the concrete structure. Some of the apartments, unfortunately, we had to add wooden floors because we like concrete floors as architects, but not all clients like that. So unfortunately, not all of the apartments, they had these beautiful concrete floors. This is the concierge, the entrance of the building, where you can come in and there's a person waiting there. It's something that's quite unique for Denmark. And here you can sort of see this urban anchor point at the waterfront in the North Harbor, marking itself. Getting back to this idea of how the building interacts with the public realm and the vista, you have this this grade level, or this new event space, exhibition space. Right now there's an exhibition. If you go and visit it, there's an exhibition on the development of the North Harbor, the many different phases of what's going on in the area that the building is placed. And over time, this can then be used for different exhibitions. On top, you can see this restaurant sticking out, giving this new public space where you can sit and get these magnificent views onto the city. The next project that I want to talk to you about, which is in the theme of transformation as a resource, is the Danish Rock Museum. The Danish Rock Museum is not in Copenhagen, but it's on the outskirts of Copenhagen in a city called Roskilde. Some of you might have heard of it because of the Roskilde Festival. Maybe you've been there, but it's a huge event. The reason why I mentioned the Roskilde Festival, you can sort of see it in this image, it's right down here, is that it's quite profound for the city, because the city is branding itself on this festival. But the city also has a super strong historic significance for Denmark, because from this bay, from this fjord, this is where the Vikings, they used to sail out on their raids and attack England and other parts of northern Europe, and then sail back with their loot. So here you have a very important Viking museum, but here you also have the cathedral, which is basically where all the kings and queens of Denmark are buried. And here, again, the Roskilde Festival, which transforms Roskilde once a year to the 4th largest city in Denmark. And in between, you have the Danish Rock Museum. The Danish Rock Museum is placed on an old concrete factory, which is called Musikon. And it had these amazing halls, just super beautiful, and this giant potential. So when we took part in this competition, one of the things we wanted to do is to make sure that we savored this sort of industrial heritage, that we protected it. We didn't want to demolish it, we wanted to use it. Because basically what we saw when we first went there on a site visit is that these halls had a huge significance for the cultural life of Roskilde. They were used for art installations, for showing these event spaces. They're also used for skateboard halls, and they're also used for parties. So we set up a series of urban guidelines which we wanted to show that we wanted to keep the halls, and at the centerpiece of these halls we wanted to click in a sort of a new cultural icon, the Danish Rock Museum. And this meant that the Rock Museum could sort of click itself into the halls and somehow connect itself and use it as extra space for the Rock Museum. Here you can see a top view of the Rock Museum before it was completed. It's not every day that you get to work on a rock museum, so we wanted to have a lot of fun while we did it. And we tried to study what kind of rock iconography we could use as materialization, sort of these studded bracelets, the gold symbols, but also this red guitar flight case. And what we wanted to do is to work with these strong contrasts, like you see punk rockers with these beautiful knitted belts, and then they have these completely worn down jeans. And in the same way, we wanted to make sure that the Rock Museum had this same contrast, that it had this sort of glamorous gold glitter box juxtaposed these worn down old halls. But at the same time, we also wanted to make a prominent building that somehow could interact with the public spaces around it. So we took the main exhibition space and we lifted it up, and it became this giant cantilevering volume, which then acts as a sort of a cover for this entrance, which can also be used for events and other types of public gatherings. So that you can sort of see that this box, basically here on top, is basically just an exhibition space. And when you enter the Rock Museum, you enter on this red carpet like you would a real rock star. So you walk along the red carpet inside this red foyer space. So if we make sort of a section cut through the building, you can basically see how the museum works. There's a exhibition space on top, there's this magnificent foyer space, and in between there's some administration functions. And basically the way we wanted to design this rock museum was that it's a black box, a little bit like your space here. And this black box could have a series of different exhibitions in it. And then the important thing for us was actually how the building again interacts with the public realm, how you sort of enter the building. Here you can see somebody having a rock star moment before they enter the red carpet into the red foyer space. But the important part of the project is also how it somehow clicks into the existing halls. Here you see one of the main patio spaces behind the Rock Museum. And here how we reused some of the halls for, this is the restaurant, which is then used for having a beer or a drink before you go up and visit the exhibition space. The red carpet that leads you into the red foyer space, and these two contrasting elements that we tried to design, that we wanted these pyramids, these prisms, to almost look like red velvet, like the inside of a guitar case, juxtapose these glitter box gold elements. And inside the red foyer space, you can actually use it for concerts, but on an everyday basis, it's also used as with these sort of designed elements. They can be rolled away and rolled in, and it's actually where you buy your ticket to have this rock experience inside the museum. And what we were hoping for was, of course, that this museum could inscribe itself in this trilogy of Roskilde's cultural heritage, the Viking Museum, the Cathedral, and the Roskilde Festival, and to create a new extension of these icons. So the next theme that I wanted to discuss with you is social engines. Sorry, just want to grab. And it's something that we noticed in Copenhagen, and it's how public buildings can bring people together in a city which is challenged with social segregation, where there's gentrification and so forth. And what we saw was that actually that the library is sort of having a sort of a huge significance on how the Copenhagen works as a city, and it's sort of changed its programming. So if you could say, like, the traditional library was basically just a place for storage books. What Rem Koolhaas tried to describe is that a library is one of the last public spaces in the city. But what we saw in Copenhagen is that actually the library is actually used for many things besides books and book reading. It's also used for theaters, cultural activities, for newspapers, cinema. You can see here, this is books. They only have a very small, significant role. But this is also where you go and get your passport made. And most importantly, what we saw is that these libraries are being used as a strategy by the municipality of Copenhagen in troubled areas as these social engines to help revitalize areas. I'll be showing two projects, or actually three projects, two of which are libraries. The other is a sort of a private public building. So the first project I wanted to show is the Northwest Library. And it's basically a library that's in an area that's completely surrounded by industrial buildings. And behind these industrial buildings, you have a lot of social housing. And it's a building that we wanted to have, we tried to say that it's a celebration of diversity. So we wanted to make sure that it embraces everybody in the neighborhood. So the way we try to do that is to make, very simply, a series of 4 stacked books. And the reason why we use books as a metaphor is that when you read a book, it's sort of, you dive into a new world and you have a new experience. And in the same way, when you enter one of these books, we also wanted to make sure that you have a unique experience. And this is something that we tried to work on in the design of each box. The building is these series of 4 boxes, but it's also pushed up against an existing cultural institution, which is right behind it. And the significance of this is that we were able to create a sort of a covered street, so that when you enter the library, you can have the possibility of going and checking out some books or returning some books, but you also have the possibility of walking down this covered street and entering a cafe, but you can also walk up the stairs and go into one of these 4 boxes. So walking down the street, the first box you meet is the kids' library. And what we try to do here is to make a very simple series of boxes, almost like a 3-dimensional Lego world, so that in some boxes you have books sticking out, some boxes there's lids on with toys inside, so that actually this act of being in a library becomes a playful experience for the kids, that they go there to play and to play with books. The second box is actually a youth library where kids, they can come after work, after school. That's much later. They can come after school and they can sit together around the table and they can do their homework. Or they can take a book, this is the youth books, and read here at the table. The third box is then the adult library, and this is where you can sort of hide behind these sort of labyrinth of wooden walls, wooden bookshelves, and sit and read and sort of indulge yourself in a book that you found. And on top, we have an event space which can be used for small concerts, for dance recitals. Here you can see some kids practicing. And And this is quite a nice space because Copenhagen is super flat. We don't have any hills or mountains like you do here, but we have 2 hills, and actually this library is situated on one of the hills of Copenhagen. So from this box you can actually have a beautiful view onto the city. As I mentioned, it's a celebration of diversity. So it's this diversity amongst cultures. You can see these 2 guys sitting here and having a nice talk. But this diversity is also amongst generations. These 2 girls sitting and talking underneath one of the cantilevered boxes. The next building within this theme of social engines is the Red Cross Volunteer House. And we won the competition to design the Red Cross Volunteer House, and it presented itself as a little bit of a paradox, because we had to design a building that's basically 700-800 square meters big, but it's an organization which has 10,000 volunteers. And this means that we had to somehow rethink how we should design the building. Here you can see sort of an example of this immense organization of volunteers that take part in the Red Cross in Denmark. And this is the Red Cross building as it looks, as you can see it today, and we had to make this extension. So what we did is we tried to make a building that's a public space as a roof. So it's this giant tribune that you can sit on top, and maybe not all of the 10,000 volunteers, they can be there at the same time, but a lot of them can be there. But it's also a public space that's accessible to the public, so that people can just come here and they can sit and read books, drink a beer or smoke a cigarette and so forth. And underneath this tribune, you actually have the Red Cross volunteer functions, where they have an amphitheater where you can sit here and you can have events a little bit like here at camp, and they can have meetings, they can have lectures and so forth, but also you can have informal gatherings underneath this concrete tribune structure, so that you also have these sort of small unique spaces underneath the tribune. So the last project along the lines of the social engine is Tingbjerg Library. This is Copenhagen. And basically Tingbjerg is a city extension, a modernistic city extension made by a very famous Danish architect and landscape architect, Sten Eiler Rasmussen. And it's a super beautiful space. And also the landscape is amazingly designed by C.T. Sørensen. What you can sort of say is profound about the space is that it's completely isolated from the rest of the city. There's only one road going in and out. And actually, what happened, I think 10 years ago, one of the biggest gang wars started there because there's huge social problems in these social houses. So basically, this is an area where there were a lot of shootings. The police, they were often present in riot gear. There's a lot of unemployed people. So the city of Copenhagen, they wanted to make a new library, a new culture house, a new citizen activity center for the people of Tingbjerg. And here you can sort of see the building that we're working on. It's almost completed. It should be completed in July, August/September. And basically, the idea for this building, it's a little bit along the lines of the Red Cross house, is that it goes in and kisses an existing structure, but it has these series of framework rooms which can be used for the local inhabitants of Tingbjerg, so that you have maker spaces, you have library spaces, but you also have areas where they can just sit and talk and meet. So it becomes a new meeting space for the people of Tingbjerg. And basically, it's the focal point of all of this city space is the school. And this is the school also designed by Sten Eiler Rasmussen, and it works as this sort of a cultural cluster where there's not only a school, but there's a big gymnasium, there's a swimming hall, and Copenhagen municipality and the housing corporations there, they wanted to make a new building. So what we try to do is to go in and interact with the school to make sure that it connects to this cultural cluster. And basically what we wanted to do is to make this framework of possibilities of rooms. But also what we noticed when we analyzed the area is that all the significant buildings there, they have a unique roof structure, both the hall, the gymnasium, but also the swimming hall. So we wanted to make a building that also had this quite profound roof scape. So this is the building. It basically looks like the slimmest building in the world. It's right now, it's only at the edges. This framework, it's only, the frame here is only 2 meters deep. But looking at it in plan, it has this sort of a funnel-like shape. And this means that when you enter the building here, you can either enter and go into the school, the swimming hall, or to the gymnasium, but you can also enter the new library. And you have this funnel-like space, and you have these series of new rooms that you can look up and see. So that from different angles, it just looks like this super thin building. But from the inside, it has this sort of new space. On the outside, we try to make sure that it clicks into the context. All the buildings in the area, they're made of these yellow bricks. So we try to use these yellow baguettes, brick baguettes, which are these sort of brick tubes, so that it mimics its surroundings, but it does it in a new way. So that it gives this sort of a cultural, this new contemporary interpretation of yellow bricks. On the inside, this frame is then made from wood. So you have these wooden lamellas that frame the inside of the space. As you can see, it's under construction. So at the end of the summer, we should have an opening of this new library. So another theme in the book is a city for kids. And one of the most difficult people to design for are actually children. Because it means that you have to sort of step out of the role of looking from above, and you have to somehow get into the eye level of kids. With any growing population, there's also growth in the amount of kids. And in Denmark, both parents work, and this means that kids, they attend a daycare center. You can sort of see here how the daycare centers over time, they've transitioned from being very strict and sitting on chairs to actually slowly becoming more informal and loose. And here you can see an image from the 60s of how the pedagogue is actually sitting in eye level with the kids. And here today, where the pedagogue, they're sitting on the ground or on the floor with the kids. And this is actually somehow how we wanted to design, to get into the eye level of kids and make sure that we design these daycare centers from the vantage point of kids. The reason why we are so interested about designing daycares well is because during a normal work week, kids, they actually spend most of their waking hours at a daycare center. They only spend around 20% of their waking hours at home and 30% in the kindergarten. And this means that their experience at kindergartens are quite profound and important on their development as individuals. You can see here, these are some of the barracks of a previously designed daycare institutions in Copenhagen. You can see here the toilets, how horrible they can look. The small steps to get up to the adult-sized toilets, how rundown they are, and so forth. So our main sort of starting point is to sort of make sure that the kids, they can sort of identify themselves within these big groups of kids, so it doesn't become these factories that that kids are being placed in. So I wanted to share with you today this Frederiksvej kindergarten, which is on Frederiksberg in Copenhagen. And we like to say it's as simple as a kid's drawing because it's basically a cluster of 11 small houses pushed together. It's this series of villages. It almost becomes a small village in itself. And it's basically 2,000 square meters of daycare, roughly, and roughly, I think, 180 kids. And these 11 houses, they're situated around these white houses, and these white houses are sort of double, triple high spaces, atrium spaces that interconnect all these small village houses. So you can sort of see here a kid's drawing that was inspirational for us when we did the design for this building. And you can see here how these houses, they click together and they become these this sort of a character of a small village. And when we designed the building, what we wanted to have is this sort of almost this experience of these babushka dolls, that you have a doll within a doll within a doll. So we wanted to design houses within houses within houses to take this village experience to the extreme, so that when you're in this atrium space, you have these small houses that are cantilevering out, and you can get a view onto the space. But also in some of the communal spaces, you also have these small houses with a small kitchen in it. When the kids sleep, they also get a small house, and they sleep within a small house. Here you can see the atrium space, that you also have these small mini houses where kids, they can crawl out. Don't worry, there's glass at the end of them, and they can sit and they can sort of look out and talk to kids on the third level or below them. And this project, it's very it's very condensed, and it's a new way of approaching daycare institutions. It's a lot of square meters, and this means that we also have to work with having quick access to outdoor areas. And this means that some of the houses, there are sort of these pergola-like structures where you can walk out and you can sort of easily get outside, because the daycare, it's on 3 levels. And here you can see some of these pergola structures and how the building it interconnects. We found this article on online on the New York Post that stated that this architectural wonder is being wasted on 5-year-olds, and we were like, yes, we did something good. We completed our work properly, because we made something that actually stands out and actually is profound for kids as well. So architectural democracy is something we like discussing a lot, and it's this idea of embracing the local community in this collective effort. A little bit along the lines of this Olafur Eliasson installation I showed previously. There are many sort of grand words by architects. I don't understand why people hire architects and then tell them what to do. There are 360 degrees, so why stick to one, by the late Sahadid. But the most profound one that we sort of like to think about is by Winston Churchill. We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. And this means that the built structure, our built environment, has a huge impact on us as individuals and also as a society. To explain a little bit about the planning process in Copenhagen, we set up this diagram series, and basically there's a huge sort of dialogue around new projects in the city. so that when a client or a developer has an idea for project, he goes to the municipality and he sits down and he explains these are the things that he would like to have in his projects. The municipality, they then send out what they call sort of a starting paper, which explains a little bit about the project, which is sent out to the local community. And then the local community has the possibility to react on this project. They can sort of voice their opinions, they can oppose, they can say, yes, it's great, they can say it's horrible. And on the basis of this sort of dialogue with the local community, the built or the project then can change, it can become less dense, less high, and so forth. So an example of this is Croyers and Croyers is situated in a historic part of Copenhagen, Christianshavn. And it's a very troubled site because for many years, architects, many different famous architects, they tried making proposals for the site, and each time the local community, they opposed it. An amazing project was designed by Erik van Egeraat. He won an international competition, and it was quite beautiful and profound, but it was too high. So basically the local community, they opposed it. Big and Henning Larsen architects, they tried sort of aligning themselves and making a new proposal for the site, the high rise and so forth. And they were all sort of opposed by the local community. So we were approached by our co-architect and the client, the developer of the site, to help design a building that could somehow fit into the context and sort of make sure that the local community would want to embrace it and take it and accept it. So what we tried to do is to sort of, through an analytical approach, is to sort of read the existing structure. These are these warehouse structures that are perpendicular to the harbor front of Copenhagen. And we then set up two new beams, so to say. This is the historic Strandgade. And what we try to do there is to make a new built form that also somehow closes off the street and reads this street line, the street structure. And then you could say what we tried to do in this community consultation process was that we wanted to make sure that the buildings, they react to important sight lines, to view lines, and so that the volume itself is molded and fits into the context. And here you can sort of see some diagram series showing how this worked. So you have these two perpendicular volumes and the one on Strandgade, and these are then molded to sort of fit into historic sight lines. What was important for us is to make sure that the ground level of the building is sort of interacts with the edge of the waterfront, that it also becomes a new waterfront to the city, and also that the grade level is, you could say, sort of open and accessible by the public. Here you can sort of see this new harbor front, how the building, it clicks into the area, but also how there's a colonnade here where people can walk underneath, and there's also an extension to the boardwalk so that it becomes a new promenade a new promenade in the city. At the same time, the volumes are then sort of molded and sort of shaped so that they fit to historic sight lines, so that this amazing prominent church, it looks like the building is reacting to it and fits into the context. What we also try to do is to give a sort of a historic rereading of these warehouse structures. We wanted to make sure that the warehouse, we wanted to make new warehouses, but they had to have some sort of a contemporary approach and a contemporary rereading of these warehouses. And these diagrams, they show different approaches to how we wanted to make these facades, but also how we wanted to make sure that the buildings are wrapped all the way around with the same material, so they really become these prominent structures. Seen from the new bridge, you can sort of see how the building, height-wise, it clicks into the context, but also how it works grade level. and also how you have these amazing apartments that have a direct view onto the city. And on Strandgade, you can also see how the building, it helps somehow complete the street and frame this historic street in this city center. In between the buildings, you have a new public space, a new public realm where people can walk through, but also there are cuts inside the building which are clad in metal mirrors, and you can somehow, you can walk through and you can get these new vistas onto the city. And then, of course, we worked with brick because we wanted to give a sort of a contemporary rereading of this context. And here we basically took the bricks and we turned them 90 degrees. So a part of the brick that normally wasn't exposed, we then made it exposed, and it gives this sort of textured and tectonic facade material. And inside you have these also these quite nice apartments, which then also fit into this geometry. So Copenhagen tomorrow. This is something about how we wanted to sort of look at the future of Copenhagen, and there are two projects that I wanted to show. One is the North Harbour, and the last is the Paper Island. Basically what we wanted to do is to sort of show how these industrial areas in Copenhagen, they have this huge potential for the development of the city. Because instead of having a city that expands with rings upon rings, you have all these islands within these cities with all these old industrial areas which now are being slated for demolition. The industry is gone and developers are taking over. And this means that the city has a potential of growing within the boundaries of the city. So the first example of this is the North Harbour. Here you can basically see 500 years of development. This is the old harbourfront line 500 years ago, and how the industrial harbourfront of Copenhagen looks today. And in 2008, COBE won the international competition for the new city extension of Copenhagen, the North Harbour, which is basically this new extension out into Øresund. And it's basically a master plan that's phased, and the idea is that this master plan can basically start very slowly at the heart of the North Harbour, where it's connected to the city, and slowly grow outwards. That it's a development that's supposed to be phased over time. So it's not a development that's supposed to happen over 5 years or 10 years, but it's supposed to happen over 20, 30, 40 years. Here you can sort of see how the island of the North Harbour is slowly growing as a landfill, and how people are embracing this new waterfront. So basically, the North Harbour has the scale of one of the historic neighbourhoods of Copenhagen, so it's actually a very prominent extension to the city. And in order to make this work, it's being strongly connected to the infrastructure of Copenhagen. And one of the main infrastructure connections will be this new metro line, which is currently being built in Copenhagen, and it's being extended as this loop line on the North Harbour. In order to make the North Harbour sort of this successful development over many years, we set up a series of dogmas, principle diagrams that we wanted to use to make sure that we could be guided through this very long planning process. So these 6 dogmas are basically, we wanted to make a series of islets, a series of mini islands. The second being is that we wanted to embrace this industrial heritage to make sure that it's not demolished, so that when over time the North Harbour is transformed, that it still has this harbour feeling. It shouldn't be just a new development, but you should still have the feeling of having a harbour front This means that the existing harbor structures should stay. As another guiding principle, we wanted to work with is urban green. And this means that at the densest point of the city, we have to work with a dense use of green. This means we have to work with green roofs, we have to work with sort of pocket parks and so forth. And as you go further out into the edge of the North Harbour, it can become this more coastal landscape. The other principle was to design within this 5-minute city, and this means from 5 minutes walking distance anywhere in the North Harbour, you have to be able to access a public transportation point. And of course, when you have these islets, these mini islands, we also want to make sure that the city is facing the waterfront, that as many places are accessible by the water as possible. And the last sort of guiding principle was what we called the intelligent grid. And the idea was that we didn't want to just make sort of a stamp of a grid that was sort of steamrolled all over the North Harbour. We wanted to make sure that we work with individual grid sizes. And this means that the grid has one type of size here because there's a certain density. And developing on the way the city develops over time, this grid size can then either scale up or scale down. And in order to make sure that we made this a sustainable development, meaning also sustainable mobility, we wanted to make sure that pedestrians and bicycles and public transportation had the right of way, and cars, they have to sort of drive a little bit more a labyrinth, so to say. So the first principle, from any point in this new development, 5 minutes walking distance from here, there's a new metro stop. Here you can see the cultural heritage. This is actually from before the silo got its new dress on, so to say, and it was still just had these cuts in it, but you can also see these prominent silo structures. A city that has access to the water. From this bridge, I think kids right now, they're jumping into the water because the weather's really good in Copenhagen at the moment. So this is actually a fantastic spot from anywhere on the North Harbour. You have quick access to the water. And this is something that people really like. This idea of urban green, this means that when we program the island, we try to work with green roofs where it's really dense. Here, Yaya Architects, on the basis of our master plan, they designed a new public space on top of a parking garage. And this, here you can sort of see the first piece of this intelligent grid in the Aarhusgade quarter. And an overview of the city. I promised to show where COBE is moving, and actually this is the warehouse number 54. This is where we will be moving, hopefully the end of June. It was supposed to be January, then April, then May, and now we're keeping our fingers crossed for June. But we're really looking forward to move out into our own development. And the reason why we're really, really proud about the North Harbour is because we weren't just able to work with the sort of the visionary master plan, this sort of large-scale master planning, but we were also able to work with a lot of the local plans, and these local plans are what defines the individual building plots and sizes and how the architecture is articulated. But besides that, we were also able to design the streetscapes, the pocket parks in between the buildings. And this means that we get to live with in a project that we designed, and we're really looking forward to it. So the last project I will show today is the Paper Island. And this is actually where COBE is today, in the heart of Copenhagen. And the reason why this is such a special site for not only us, because we live there, but also for the rest of Copenhagen, is because this is actually an island that was closed off to the public for the past 300 years. And the reason why it was closed off to the public for 300 years is because first it was a naval base. So this whole area was basically a giant naval base. Then 100 years ago, it was transformed into a warehouse storage where actually you had giant newspaper rolls which were stored for the printing press. And that's hence where you got the name the Paper Island. Here you can sort of see how it was used before. These giant rolls of newspaper, printing paper were basically stored in these amazing halls. And with the help of sort of intelligent planning, this island was opened up to the public, and people really embraced this island, these existing halls. And it went from being this, you could say, this empty paper storage space, and it became this new public mecca for enjoying the city. And what was also nice is that actually we embraced the space quite well, because this is actually how COBE's office looked before it was refurbished. And then actually afterwards, this is the same space with a few daylight, sort of roof light windows and a few windows in the facade, and became this really nice space. But there's also these series of magnificent halls. These are also halls with wooden structures, which show how old some of these warehouse buildings are. And they were also somehow used for design companies as exhibition spaces, also for event spaces. People rented these for parties and so forth. So you could say that by opening up this sort of closed island to the public, it was completely embraced by all of Copenhagen, and it was also embraced by COBE. And we wanted to make sure that this amazing life that you have in these halls could stay after it was redeveloped. So this is our proposal for the redevelopment of the Paper Island. And basically what we wanted to show in this cartoon drawing is we wanted to make sure that after the island has been redeveloped, that actually there's these new halls which have the characteristics of the existing halls, that you have the possibility to have a new street food there, you have the possibility to have a new swimming hall there, and so forth. So that when the island is rebuilt, that you can have these magnificent new spaces that are new and refurbished, but are able to embrace this public life that was already already developed there. Here you can sort of see an early visualization for the water culture house. We also partook in the competition for this. Unfortunately, we lost. We were teamed up with Big, and Kengo Kuma, he won. So it will look a little bit different than this early visualization. Here we try to show how some of the old structures can be incorporated in the new warehouses. And actually you can have these new events. This is maybe from the Copenhagen Fashion Week, which happens, I think, 2 times a year, where you can have a catwalk and so forth. And then the idea is that on top of these new warehouses, these new 5 warehouses, that you can have a new development, a new roof structure where you have social housing, you have private housing, but you also have hotels, and you also have private gardens. So seen from above, you have the Paper Island after it's transformed, and in the heart of it, a new public space. And the reason why we had to demolish the existing halls is because underneath we have to place a new underground car park. And here in the section you can sort of see how we have these new halls, and on top these new housing structure. And from on top, you can also have these. Here you can see these private gardens for the houses that are quickly accessible, so that you also have a sort of some private outdoor spaces which aren't accessible by the public, but only for the people who live there. At grade level, you have this green heart, where you have this interaction between the halls and this green canopy. And the one thing we wanted to do is we also wanted to extend the boardwalk a little bit like we did on Krøyers Plads, to make sure that the southern exposure that this site has, that you have a place where people can sit and drink beer, eat food from the street food, or they can just jump in the water if they want to. And basically, we try to work along the logic of Krøyers Plads, and you have these 5 halls and a new swimming hall, and on top of that, you put a series of new housing beams, and they become this extruded structure. And yes, and then you have this new prominent development at the edge of the waterfront. So thank you very much for your time. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Thomas, for your fascinating presentation. My first question is, most of the projects that you showed us are from Copenhagen, from your hometown, but also from your neighborhood, the neighborhood of COBE. So is it different designing at home than it is abroad? Do you feel more criticism? Do you criticize yourself more, maybe, because you ride your bike back and forth every day?
Well, it means that you are very much attentive to detail and how projects develop, because every mistake you make or every mistake you make in the design process, it's going to be in your face every day. So we really like to work our projects in great detail, but it doesn't mean that we only work in Copenhagen. We also work in Scandinavia and Germany, and we're also somehow working a little bit in North America. And actually, we find that this is just as challenging, because it means that we have to somehow go in with our analytical approach and read each context and make sure that we make contextual buildings that fit into a new context that we maybe don't know so well. But yeah, it is difficult working in your own neighborhood. There's a lot of criticism from our peers sometimes.
I can imagine. When we talked in Bratislava, we talked a little bit about Jan Gehl and how his vision has such a global influence of making people-friendly cities. And I think we saw from your presentation today that you also get a lot of influence from Jan Gehl. So do you think it's important having such a global ambassador for Danish architecture? And is that something that's unique for Danish architecture, making people-friendly cities?
I don't know if it's unique for Denmark, but Jan Gehl, he's a magnificent person, and he's a cornerstone of Danish planning, his approach to public space and public awareness. And we, of course, like to embrace a lot of his thoughts about scaling down walkability, experiencing things from the public eye, from eye level, and making sure that there's this strong interaction between buildings and the public realm. So you could sort of say we are a little bit the children or offspring of Jan Gehl, but yeah. So we're very much we're very happy for his teachings.
Maybe my final question before we open the floor for the discussion is: we went on this urban walk of Prague today. So maybe a quick assessment, what you thought, what the potential is. Hard question, I know.
Yeah, it's first of all, I think Prague is a magnificent city. I think what's nice is that, of course, that you have this amazing historic center. Of course, it's also very touristic. But what's also nice is that you have this communist background with these communist-built structures, for better and for worse. And I think they're also quite profound for the history of Prague as a city. But as your maps here show, that there's a huge planning potential. I think we went to one of these brown sites that's actually cutting between two neighborhoods, and I think the potential of trying to integrate these two neighborhoods cut in half by infrastructure is just looks like such an amazing project. I'm sorry, I forget the name of the site.
It was Bubny, between Letna and Holešovice. So maybe when we have the competition, COBE can join.
We would be humbled to be able to join the competition. I think there's huge potential there. But I think just already the history here is already quite significant and profound to work within. So.
Well, thank you very much. Now we'll open the floor to the discussion. We have this throwing microphone, which our colleague will throw at you. Please introduce yourself and ask away. Who's first?
All questions are welcome, so please shoot. I thought you were kidding there.
No, it's really a throwing microphone. It's our first time using it. Well, we'll see if we'll ever use it again.
It's crazy. Hi, my name's Hannah, and I'm curious. So I'm moving to Copenhagen at the end of August, and I heard it's extremely difficult to find housing, especially for students.
Yes.
And so I wanted to ask sort of the reasons why. Why is Copenhagen so expensive? And also if you can talk a bit more about affordability and public housing and how there are plans to make housing more affordable.
You could say that basically what you're touching upon is how Copenhagen is somehow becoming victim to its own success. And because there isn't that much space to make new projects, this means that the prices there are really going up. But what we see also is that that we also try to embrace in our planning projects is that when the city of Copenhagen, they make a new local plan for an area, now they're obligated to make, if they make housing, 100% housing, 25%, a minimum of 25% of this housing has to be social housing. And then the rest, 75% can be private housing. So that's somehow a step in the right direction. But another problem, which is also there, is that a lot of the local plans are based about having houses that are an average of 100 square meters. And this means in order to make very small apartments, you have to make really big apartments to average out at 100 square meters. So this is also something that there's becoming more awareness of. And there's also just continually there's being built more student housing and more low-cost housing. Unfortunately, we don't have any of these in our project. Part of the Paper Island will be social housing. But it is a little bit of a sort of a difficult part about this presentation is that the two housing projects that we show, they're both high-end apartments. And it's something that we have other projects that we are currently being developed in a different price range, so to say. I don't know if this answers your question, but it's a very difficult thing. But I understand it's something that you're also experiencing here in Prague, that with a congested housing market, prices are just going up, and it means that it's becoming difficult for average incomes to stay within the city, and they're sort of being pushed out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's see if you catch it.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, thanks for the lecture. I want to ask you, in the project of the silo, you said the the ground floor and the roof is or the upper floor is public. Does it mean you can take the elevator up and there's a viewpoint, or is it a 5-star restaurant, or what is up there?
Well, there is a restaurant up there, so you can just go up and have a drink and a cafe. But it's not a 5-star restaurant. It's supposed to be an average price restaurant. I haven't been up there myself. I don't know. I never managed to get around to it, but I think it's our best possibility to sort of making this vista accessible. Because the worst that could happen is just to have this giant penthouse on top of the housing project. And at least now you have the possibility of getting people up there, even if it means you have to buy a cup of coffee or a beer.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
Good evening. My name is Christopher. Thank you for your awesome presentation.
Thank you.
My question is, many projects which you showed us have been situated by the sea, and it seems like a space when the city will grow in the future. How you can see the threat of raising the water level connected with global warming? Are you prepared for that, and what's your estimation about that?
Big questions.
Yeah, but that is a big question. But in the North Harbour, basically, the edges of the quay are already sort of adjusted in the sort of this planning process and the redevelopment of the North Harbour to accommodate sort of rising sea waters, which is really unfortunate that we have to plan for that. But it's part of the projects.
Anyone else? Maybe you can throw it back.
Hello, I'm Lucas, and I have a question about the local communities, which are actually somehow in part of the projects.
Yes.
When you speak about the local communities, who are those people? I mean, how local they are? Is it somebody, can it be somebody from the other end of the city just like telling that he doesn't like the shape or the height of the building, or just the neighborhoods around?
Copenhagen is subdivided into sort of the local neighborhoods. So, and each neighborhood has its own sort of local government. And within this, then you can sort of voice your opinion. So, of course, you have to live within this local community. So, in Christianshavn, it's actually a super socialist there, and it's where Christiania is, and there's really, they really have a fighting spirit. So they're very difficult to work with, but for example, in Croix Place, we managed to sort of listen to what they were aiming for and what they were willing to accept. But it means that not everybody can give their opinion to a project, but within the local community, you can.
Okay.
Oh, this is cool.
You just wanted to try.
Yes, exactly. I want to be part of the game.
Hello, I'm Nicole.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask some questions about the paper island.
Yes.
I have been there, I have seen the atmosphere and everything, but it was a big wow for me to see the project. So you were talking about the communities. First question I want to ask, how people accepted this big change which should come. That's the first one. And the second one, who is the investor? I understand from the architecture and the urban point of view that's a really important site in the city and so on, but it's really a special place for the people of Copenhagen, as I have seen so far. So how does it work, like in the social part of this story?
Well, first of all, there were, as I mentioned, there's this planning process. So as part of writing the local plan for the paper island, sort of the geometry of the building was defined. And this means the height lines, the inclination of the facades. And actually, because the center piece of the island, it's quite high, there was a lot of opposition to it. So there has been a lot of pushback to the paper island, but the local plan was accepted, and it's been sort of, now it's a legal document, and we're using it as sort of the framework to our further design work. To explain a little bit about the financial background of the project, the island was sort of bought, or he bought the development rights. It's the same developer as the silo. And he sort of made a joint venture with the City Port Authority, which is a publicly owned company. And at the City Port Authority, they're basically developing land, and the money they earn from the development, they're reinvesting into public infrastructure, for example, the metro and so forth. So it's a closed circle. But it's a joint venture, so it's 50%, I don't know exactly the split, but it's the City Port Authority, and then it's the financial backbone on the private part is actually a Danish pension company. So it's also somehow, you could say, going back to the Danish people. But I think that's something that's quite unique about, for example, the North Harbour development, is that it is, it's the City Port Authority that is developing it. So they are basically developing a new piece of land, and this, they're reinvesting the money to make a new metro line. So it's not that they're just pocketing the money, but they're actually reinvesting into the city. At the same time, they're also the metro line they're developing. They're sort of pulling out huge amounts of earth from the ground, and they're using this as a landfill. So it's really like this not only closed circuit economy, but it's also a unique way of sort of rethinking development. So it's also somewhat sustainable.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Okay, it's all the way back there, so good luck.
Are you sure? I will like put it inside and then somebody. Okay. Hi.
Hello.
My name is Clara. I just have a question about public spaces. Because what I like about Copenhagen and maybe other Scandinavian cities is that you have a lot of big and really nice public spaces, and it's really different to Czech Republic or Prague. And my question is, like, is it because maybe the attitude of the people is different, or do you have like a special approach? You design these things, because even if it's like a huge mess of bicycles, it still looks nice and neat, and people actually care about it. And yeah, I would just like to know if you have any idea about that.
It's a really good question, and I wish I could answer if there's a. But I myself, I never really thought about it. Sort of the quality of public spaces in, for example, Copenhagen or Denmark. But then I was living in Amsterdam for many years, and actually I sort of realized that there's not that much public space. The streetscape is super condensed, and first after I sort of moved back to Denmark, I sort of understood the significance of the public spaces in Denmark. But it is something that there's a huge awareness to. But it's also, again, going back to Jan Gehl, it's also something that he has been very a prominent figure on, is that the city has to focus on these public spaces, to invest in these, in order to attract people to stay within the cities.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Maybe 2 last questions. Okay, if there's no more question, maybe one for me. So what's next for COBE? What's next for you, Thomas? What projects should we expect in the near future?
I think the Paper Island is actually is not only is a significant project, but it also sort of says a lot about the scale of projects we're working on at the moment. And I think the challenges that we're facing is that we're working on these very large-scale developments, and how do we make sure that we embrace this knowledge we have from smaller buildings and make sure that they work according to our own principles, guiding principles on scale, size, and interaction with the public realm. So I think, this is sort of the next step for COBE, is how do we make sure that these large-scale projects, We have a lot of them underway. How do we make sure that they sort of live up to our own standards?
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for giving such a fascinating talk, and hope to see you back at camp soon.
And
thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here and taking time out to come and listen.